The loudest applause of my graduation ended with the quietest sentence. As I reached for my diploma, my stepmother leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "Don't enjoy this too much. Today was never meant to be about you." I smiled for the graduation photo anyway. I had no idea that before the evening ended, the same crowd cheering around us would witness a silence no one could explain. My name is Amara Ndlovi, and I was the first person in my family to graduate from university. My late father spent years working double shifts so I could chase that dream, but he passed away before he could see it happen. After he died, my stepmother, McKenna Adeyemi, moved her daughter Esh into the center of every family celebration. If Esh won a school prize, balloons filled the house. If I passed an important exam, I was told not to make anyone feel uncomfortable. Over time, I stopped expecting praise. I only wanted one peaceful graduation day. That wasn't too much to ask, or so I believed. Graduation morning was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. I woke up early, put on my graduation gown, and looked at myself in the mirror with a smile. I had worked for years to reach this moment. I remembered all the long nights of studying, the difficult exams, and every challenge I had overcome. Today was finally the day I would receive my university diploma. When I arrived at the campus, everything felt perfect. My friends ran toward me with flowers, hugs, and big smiles. My professors congratulated me and told me how proud they were of my hard work. Even relatives who lived far away had traveled across the country just to celebrate with me. For a little while, I truly believed this day would be filled with nothing but happiness. Then my family arrived. The feeling changed almost immediately. My stepmother, McKenna, didn't even congratulate me. She walked past me as if I were just another guest. Instead, she proudly stood beside my stepsister, Esh, and introduced her to everyone they met. "This is my daughter," she said with a big smile. "She will become the future lawyer of our family." People looked at Esh, then looked at me with confused faces. A few even congratulated her by mistake, believing she was the graduate. I forced myself to laugh because I didn't want to embarrass anyone, but it kept happening again and again. Every new person heard the same introduction. Before the graduation ceremony had even started, I realized my biggest day was no longer about me. Someone was quietly turning my own celebration into a stage for someone else. After the graduation ceremony ended, everyone walked to the university ballroom for the celebration. More than 230 guests filled the large hall. Round tables were covered with beautiful decorations, and people were laughing, talking, and taking photos together. It was supposed to be a joyful evening where graduates celebrated years of hard work with the people they loved. I thought things would finally become normal. I hoped everyone would simply enjoy the moment and let me celebrate the biggest achievement of my life. My classmates came over one by one. We laughed about the stressful exams, the late-night study sessions, and all the moments we thought we would never make it to graduation. My lecturers shook my hand and told my family how proud they were of me. One professor even said I had always been one of the kindest students in the class because I never refused to help others when they were struggling. Hearing those words meant a lot to me because I had worked hard not only for good grades, but also to be a good person. But every happy conversation lasted only a few seconds before McKenna stepped in. Whenever someone smiled at me and said, "Congratulations, Amara. You earned this," McKenna quickly interrupted with a bright smile. "Thank you, but you should also hear about Esh. She's planning to study law. She's so talented. Everyone says she has a brilliant future." Then she would continue talking about Esh's achievements, her dreams, and everything she hoped to become. At first, people listened politely. They smiled and nodded because they didn't want to be rude. But after it happened over and over again, I noticed the confusion on their faces. They had come to celebrate my graduation, yet every conversation somehow became about someone who wasn't even graduating. I barely had the chance to answer simple questions. If someone asked me about my future plans, McKenna answered with another story about Esh. If someone praised my hard work, she quickly changed the subject before I could even say thank you. I looked around the room and realized people were beginning to notice the pattern. Some guests exchanged quiet looks with each other. Others suddenly became silent. A few smiled awkwardly before walking away to another table. No one wanted to create a scene on such an important day. No one argued with McKenna or asked her to stop. But the warm and happy feeling in the ballroom slowly disappeared. The laughter became quieter, the conversations became shorter, and uncomfortable silence slowly took the place of celebration. Everyone could see what was happening, even if nobody was brave enough to say it out loud. As the evening continued, the host walked onto the stage with a warm smile and thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about the graduates, their families, and the years of hard work that had brought everyone together. Then he made a simple announcement. He invited a few close family members to come forward and say a few words about the graduates. Everyone smiled because they expected heartfelt speeches filled with love, pride, and happy memories. I quietly looked toward my family. Even after everything that had happened that day, a small part of me still hoped my stepmother would finally say something kind. McKenna stood up confidently and walked to the stage. She adjusted the microphone and smiled at the guests as if she had been waiting for this moment all evening. She began talking about how difficult it was to raise children and how much parents sacrifice for their families. She spoke about hard work, success, and the importance of making good choices in life. Many people nodded politely as they listened. At first, her words sounded thoughtful and respectful. Then she slowly turned her head toward Esh and smiled proudly. "Some children are born to make you proud," she said as she looked directly at her daughter. The room became very quiet. Then McKenna looked away from Esh and continued speaking. "And some simply benefit from opportunities they didn't deserve." Her words hung in the air. Nobody laughed. Nobody clapped. I didn't have to ask who she was talking about. Everyone in that ballroom understood. I felt my heart sink as hundreds of eyes slowly turned toward me. Some people looked shocked. Others looked down at their tables because they didn't know where else to look. A few guests stared at McKenna as if they couldn't believe she had said those words during a graduation celebration. I stood completely still, trying to keep my face calm. My hands were shaking, but I refused to cry in front of everyone. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, yet I had become the target of a public insult. For the first time in my life, my humiliation wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It wasn't whispered inside the house where only family could hear it. More than 230 people had witnessed it together, and the joyful celebration that had filled the ballroom only moments earlier disappeared into complete silence. I couldn't stay inside the ballroom any longer. My chest felt tight, and every breath became harder than the last. Without saying a word to anyone, I quietly walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could still hear soft conversations, but no one tried to stop me. I needed a few minutes away from the crowd. I needed a place where I could think without hundreds of eyes looking at me. Outside, the evening sky was painted with soft orange and golden colors as the sun slowly began to disappear. A cool breeze touched my face, and for the first time that day, everything became quiet. I stood alone near the garden outside the university and looked at the sunset. It reminded me of another time, years earlier, when my father and I used to sit together after dinner. We would watch the evening sky while I studied. He worked long hours every day, but no matter how tired he was, he always made time to ask about my classes and encourage me to keep going. Whenever I felt like giving up, he smiled and said, "One day, I'll be sitting in the front row, watching you walk across that stage." He believed in me even before I believed in myself. But life had other plans. He became sick before I finished university, and I lost him long before graduation day arrived. During the ceremony, one chair in the front row had been reserved beside my family. It stayed empty from beginning to end. No one spoke about it. No one looked at it for very long. But I noticed it every single time I looked toward the audience. Standing outside, I finally understood why my heart hurt so much. McKenna's cruel words had embarrassed me, but they were not the reason tears filled my eyes. I wasn't crying because someone had tried to make me feel small. I was crying because the one person who would have stood up for me wasn't there. My father would have smiled with pride before I even received my diploma. He would have hugged me without caring what anyone else thought. At that moment, I missed him more than I ever had before, and no achievement felt complete without him beside me. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, trying to calm myself before going back inside. I wiped my eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that I had worked too hard to let anyone steal this day from me. When I finally returned to the ballroom, the celebration was still going on, but everything felt different. People smiled at me with kindness, and a few quietly placed a hand on my shoulder as I walked past. They didn't need to say anything. Their faces showed that they had seen what happened. As I stood near one of the tables, my university mentor, Professor Daniels, slowly walked toward me. She had always supported me throughout my years at the university. Whenever I struggled with difficult classes or doubted myself, she reminded me that I was stronger than I believed. She looked at me with gentle eyes and held a small sealed envelope in both hands. "Amara," she said softly, "this arrived at my office earlier this afternoon. It was addressed to you. I thought today would be the right time to give it to you." I looked down at the envelope. My name was written neatly across the front. For a moment, I simply stared at it. With careful hands, I opened it. Inside was a small flash drive wrapped in a folded note. The moment I saw the writing on the label, my heart almost stopped. It was my father's handwriting. I recognized every letter immediately. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, school notes, and little messages he used to leave on the kitchen table before going to work. Written across the flash drive were only a few simple words. "For Amara's graduation day." My fingers began to shake so badly that I almost dropped it. Professor Daniels quietly explained that my father had visited the university several years earlier, before his illness became serious. During that visit, he had left this envelope with instructions that it should only be given to me on the day I graduated. He had planned this long before any of us knew how little time he had left. I held the flash drive tightly in my hand, unable to move. Part of me wanted to know what my father had said. Another part of me was afraid. If I played that video, I would hear his voice again after all these years. I wasn't ready for that moment. Not yet. A little later that evening, as everyone was still talking quietly inside the ballroom, something unexpected happened. The doors opened, and several men and women walked inside together. I recognized a few faces after a moment. They were my father's former coworkers. Some of them had not seen me since I was a little girl. They had heard about my graduation and wanted to come, even though they arrived late. The moment they saw me, they smiled warmly. One older man shook my hand with both of his hands and said, "Your father talked about this day for years. He always believed you would make it." His words stopped me completely. One by one, they began sharing stories that I had never heard before. One coworker laughed as he remembered how my father carried copies of my school report cards in his work bag. During lunch breaks, he proudly showed them to anyone who was willing to look. He celebrated every good grade as if he had earned it himself. Another coworker smiled through tears as she told everyone that my father often worked extra shifts without complaining. When people asked why he never took a day off, he always gave the same answer. "My daughter has a dream," he would say. "If I work a little harder today, maybe her future will be a little easier tomorrow." Another person remembered how my father refused to spend money on himself because he wanted to save every extra dollar for my education. He never called it a sacrifice. He called it an investment in his daughter's future. As I listened, I realized there was so much about my father's love that I had never known. For years, McKenna had made me believe I had simply been lucky. She often acted as if my success had come easily or that I had. As my father's former coworkers finished speaking, the feeling inside the ballroom changed completely. The room was no longer filled with uncomfortable silence. Instead, people began looking at me with kindness and respect. For years, many of my relatives had only heard McKenna's version of our family. They believed everything she said because they had never asked anyone else. They thought I stayed quiet because I had nothing important to say. They never knew the full story. Then something unexpected happened. One of my classmates stood up and smiled at me. She told everyone that during our first year at university, I spent many afternoons helping younger students who were struggling with their classes. I never asked for money or expected anything in return. I simply wanted them to succeed because I knew how difficult university could be. After that, another classmate shared his own memory. He explained that when he couldn't afford expensive textbooks, I let him borrow mine for weeks. Sometimes I even stayed late in the library so we could study together using the same book. He said he might never have passed those classes without that help. A professor spoke next. She remembered seeing me volunteer every weekend at a local community center, teaching children who needed extra help with reading and writing. She smiled and said that even during the busiest weeks before exams, I always found time to help someone else. Then one of my neighbors quietly shared how I often carried groceries for an elderly woman who lived alone on our street. I had never told anyone about it because I didn't think it was something special. It was simply the right thing to do. Story after story filled the room. Nobody talked about my grades first. Nobody mentioned awards or certificates. Instead, they talked about my kindness, my patience, my honesty, and the way I treated people. I felt tears filling my eyes, but this time they were different. For years, I had been judged by words that were never true. But now, people were speaking from their own experiences. They had seen my actions with their own eyes. For the first time in my life, the room was not seeing the person McKenna had described for years. They were finally seeing the woman I had worked so hard to become. After everyone finished sharing their memories, the host looked at me with gentle eyes. He walked over quietly and placed the microphone into my hands. "Amara," he said softly, "if you would like to say a few words, the stage is yours." For a moment, I looked down at the microphone without moving. I could have talked about everything that had happened that evening. I could have repeated every hurtful word McKenna had said. I could have defended myself in front of all 230 guests. Instead, I picked up my father's envelope and walked slowly toward the stage. The ballroom became completely silent. Every person in the room watched as I stood behind the microphone. I held the envelope close to my heart, not because I needed proof of anything, but because it reminded me why I had never given up. I looked around the room and took a slow breath. "I know today has been an emotional day," I began. "But I don't want my graduation to be remembered because someone tried to make me feel small." I paused for a moment. I wanted to be remembered because one person believed in me before anyone else did. I gently held up the envelope. My father worked harder than anyone I have ever known. He taught me that success is not about proving someone wrong. It is about becoming the kind of person you can be proud of when you look in the mirror. Many people quietly listened without taking their eyes off me. "There will always be people who doubt you," I continued. "There will always be voices telling you that you are not good enough. But you don't have to answer every unkind word. Sometimes the strongest answer is to keep working, keep growing, and keep treating people with kindness even when they don't do the same for you." I smiled through my tears. The people who truly love us never stop believing in us. Even after they are gone, their love continues to guide us every single day. When I finished speaking, I lowered the microphone and stood quietly for a second. Then the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause that followed was not celebrating an argument or a public victory. It was something much deeper. People were not clapping because someone had been embarrassed. They were clapping because they had finally seen the truth. And the truth had never needed to shout to be heard. A few months after graduation, my life began to move in a new direction. I accepted my first professional job, and every day brought new responsibilities and new opportunities to learn. The first weeks were challenging, but I enjoyed every moment because I knew I had earned my place through years of hard work. Every morning, I remembered the promise I had made to my father, to never give up, no matter how difficult life became. That promise gave me strength whenever I faced problems. As time passed, my life became busier. I focused on my career, met wonderful people at work, and slowly built the future I had dreamed about for so many years. The painful memories from graduation did not disappear overnight, but they no longer controlled my thoughts. Instead of carrying anger with me every day, I chose to focus on the life I was creating. Little by little, peace replaced the hurt I had carried for so long. My relationship with McKenna never became warm or close. We were polite whenever we met at family gatherings, but nothing was the same as before. We didn't have long conversations, and we never spoke about what happened at my graduation. Surprisingly, we didn't need to. Something had already changed. After that evening, McKenna stopped interrupting people whenever they congratulated me. She no longer tried to turn every conversation toward Ash whenever someone mentioned my achievements. If relatives asked about my work, she quietly listened instead of changing the subject. If friends celebrated one of my successes, she simply nodded without trying to make someone else the center of attention. Nobody argued with her. Nobody demanded that she apologize. Nobody forced her to behave differently. The difference came because everyone who had attended my graduation had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had heard my father's friends speak. They had listened to my professors, classmates, and neighbors share their own experiences. They no longer depended on one person's version of the story. Family gatherings slowly became peaceful again. Relatives treated me with respect, not because of my job title or my university degree, but because they had come to know my character for themselves. They had watched how I handled pain without becoming cruel. They had seen that I answered kindness with kindness, even when it wasn't returned. That experience taught me one of the greatest lessons of my life. Real respect cannot be won by shouting louder than someone else. It cannot be forced through arguments or angry words. It grows quietly over time, when people continue to see honesty, patience, and good character again and again. In the end, my success was never measured by my diploma or my career alone. It was measured by the kind of person I chose to become, even when life gave me every reason to become someone else. Today, my university diploma hangs on the wall in my home. Right beside it is my favorite photograph of my father. Every morning before I leave for work, I look at both of them for a few seconds. Most people would probably notice the diploma first, because it represents years of study and hard work. But to me, the photograph is even more important. The diploma reminds me of what I achieved. The photograph reminds me why I never gave up. Whenever I look at my father's smiling face, I remember the evenings we spent together while I studied at the kitchen table. I remember how tired he was after working long hours, yet he still found time to encourage me. He never cared about being praised. He only wanted me to have a better future than he had. Years before I graduated, we made a simple promise to each other. He promised that he would always believe in me, even when I doubted myself. I promised that I would never stop trying, no matter how difficult life became. Life changed those plans in a way neither of us expected. My father became ill, and, before graduation day arrived, he was gone. He never got the chance to sit in the front row like he had dreamed. He never got to watch me walk across the stage or hold my diploma in my hands. One promise was interrupted by life, but the other promise stayed alive inside my heart every single day. Whenever I felt tired, I remembered his faith in me. Whenever someone tried to make me feel small, I remembered the way he always reminded me of my worth. Whenever life became difficult, I kept moving forward because giving up would have broken the promise I made to him. As the years passed, people stopped talking about the painful speech at my graduation. Nobody remembered the cruel words that were meant to embarrass me in front of hundreds of guests. Those words slowly disappeared because they had no power to change the truth. Instead, people remembered something much stronger. They remembered the young woman who refused to answer hate with hate. They remembered the daughter who honored her father's love with quiet strength. They remembered the smile that stayed on my face even when my heart was breaking. That was the real ending of my graduation. It was never just the day I received a diploma. It became the day I proved that kindness, courage, and love will always leave a longer memory than cruelty ever can. Some people spend years trying to make another person's light appear smaller. But real light doesn't compete. It quietly keeps shining until everyone notices it on their own. Your greatest achievement will never be proving your critics wrong. It will be refusing to become like them. If someone tried to ruin your biggest day in front of hundreds of people, would you answer them, or let your life become the response? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more unforgettable family stories where dignity speaks louder than revenge.